Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is Minouche Shafik, and I'm the director of LSE, and we're very happy to have you with us for this fantastically interesting event on the fight for the open society and the future of philanthropy, hosted by LSE's School of Public Policy. Welcome to those in the room, and also especially welcome to those who are on the online. That was their way of saying hello. Let me start with an introduction. Lord Mark Malloch-Brown is president of the Open Society Foundations, the world's largest private funder of independent groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights. He joined OSF as president in January 2021, having previously sat on the global board since 2009. Mark has worked to advance human rights, justice, and development for more than 4 decades, serving as in a variety of roles, including head of the United Nations Development Programme, as UN Deputy Secretary General under Kofi Annan, and as British government minister in the Foreign Office responsible for Africa and Asia, as well as in a range of other international institutions, civil society groups, and businesses. For me, I have crossed paths with Mark on a number of occasions. We were vice presidents together at the World Bank, where Mark did a brilliant job as a political strategist and also presided over the first time the World Bank ever used the C word for corruption. Do you remember that, Mark? And really opened up the institution from its history of being rather inward-looking and more secretive. We also worked together in the UK government, where Mark was Minister for Africa at the Foreign Office when I was at the Department for International Development. And of course, we both currently work on the board of BRAC, which is the largest Southern-based NGO in the world focused on poverty. And we're both crossbenchers in the House of Lords. But the main thing I remember about working with Mark is whenever you're around Mark, good things happen, things get better, and it's also fun. So that is my abiding memory. Tonight, we're going to hear a few words from Mark on the current state and future of the open society and those values around the world. And after that, we'll have a conversation initially with me, and then we're eager to hear from students, alumni, and friends, both in the hall and online. The online questions will be moderated by a colleague from the School of Public Policy, and those who are asking questions, we'd be grateful if you gave us your name and affiliation. And if you're following the event on Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Open Society. This event will be recorded and released as a podcast afterwards. So with that, let me turn to Lord Malloch-Brown. The floor is yours.
Well, Minouche, thank you very much. And, you know, our friendship over many years is 2 very young vice presidents together at the World Bank, although I've never quite got over the fact you were younger, through our collaboration and cooperation on so many things. It's a real pleasure to join you today and have a lot of friends in the audience as well. And you know, I'm thrilled to hear that Mark Lowcock had just launched his new book here on humanitarian relief today. He, having, like so many others, been a long-time friend here. And let me just begin by saying that the concept of open society, and indeed the foundations which carry that name, you know, began here at the LSE. George Soros is an alum of here. What brought him to open society was first the experience of growing up under Nazi persecution as a Jew in Budapest, followed by communism, from which he fled and came as a very poor student to London and waited tables, got a small scholarship from a sort of organization for displaced Jews in London, and it allowed him to come and study at the LSE. where he, of course, and I think we're going to come back to this later, studied under the remarkable Karl Popper. And it's the experience of that childhood combined with the formation of his academic ideas here at the LSE, which led to open society. And open society is much more than just a sort of cheerleader for democracy and human rights. It's a philosophy expressed in many books that George has written around the agency of individuals and allowing societies to, or ensuring that societies allow those individuals full expression and engagement in society, and a belief that while individuals will make many mistakes, the collective strength and resilience of society will be hugely gained by inclusion. And it's interesting because now we are engaged in a little bit of a rethink and a rebranding even around the world we're living in now. And while the words of Karl Popper seem strange to a younger generation of OSF leaders, their belief in an OSF or Open Society Foundations, let's say, which is focused on building inclusive democracies which remove barriers against inclusion, whether those barriers are around race or ethnicity or economic class or religion, is a very, very powerful idea for my colleagues at OSF today. It's, if you like, a sort of reimagining of the Popper idea in a new language of inclusion and diversity for today's world. But perhaps the more significant still sort of piece of history about open society was that George, having made a lot of money in his career, in his 60s, turned to philanthropy big time, in fact, in his 50s. And, he had a beginner's luck. He invested heavily in Central Europe and heavily in apartheid South Africa. And within a few short years, from the mid-80s to the end of the 80s, in the case of Central Europe, and a little later in the case of South Africa, was part of these extraordinary wins where those walls fell, barriers did fall, democracy seemed to be on the ascendant. And the foundations went through a period of almost sort of triumphalist acceptance that the sort of democracy wave was not going to stop, and that we should instead focus on the qualitative issues around democracy and human rights, making sure that discriminated groups didn't get left out, of the new sort of democratic compacts in countries. So whether it was LGBTQI or other groups excluded, Roma in Europe, for example, we very much became focused on making sure nobody got left behind. And perhaps we're guilty of taking our eye off the mainstream, the main ball, the main field of play, and slow perhaps to react to the fact that, if you like, on the main field, the game had suddenly started going in the other direction, and that the democratic gains were being reversed. And, Freedom House, the chronicler of the state of democracy in the world, has reported 18 years of democratic decline as the world has gone back from that sort of glorious 90s, early years of this century moment. And that in a way has been a challenge. And I think as we reflect on it, it's not just the challenge of the rise of authoritarian leaders in so many parts of the world, although I'm going to come back to that because it's a critical bit of it. But it's, that doctrines we were so devoted to, like human rights, were perceived by many revisionists writing about both human rights or democracy, in both cases, to no longer be serving society at large and in full, that these doctrines were applied to the few, but not the all. And that sort of steady underpinning of the, if you like, intellectual case for human rights and indeed for democracy was then compounded by the rise of these new authoritarian democrats, in many cases, people who came to power by the ballot, but have since hollowed out the democracy of their country's institutions. And it is, we all hear the numbers about the decline of democracy, but if you look at it from the point of view of a president of open society whose predecessors, like I myself when I was at the UN, could go anywhere and travel anywhere and enjoy a welcome for the sort of the support we were bringing and the issues we were raising, we have seen, to use an old metaphor, the dominoes falling one by one. OSF has shuttered its doors now quite a while ago in China, when George Soros became appalled by the turn of direction in that country. But similarly, we've shuttered our doors in India, because under the Modi government, the requirements to operate would completely prevent us speaking or supporting the kind of open society actors we would want to support. In Turkey, the former chairman of our foundation is in jail, and the list goes on. In Russia, again, we have obviously long since shuttered our doors. And just in the year and a half since I have led the foundation, we first had to evacuate our colleagues from Myanmar, then from Afghanistan, and we thought from Ukraine, although wisely they refused to go further than Lviv. And just yesterday when I spoke to the head of our foundation, he was back in Kiev and planting spring flowers in the garden of the office, an office which only a month or so ago had had sandbags around it and was being used as a hospital for injured civilians. So, there is a little good news in this, but that sense of contraction is real. So just a word, and I know we're going to come back to this in the questions, so I won't dwell on it, but just a word on, the solutions. And I think, we have a little bit struggled, all of us, as we think about it. We're a wealthy foundation, as you heard, the wealthiest in this area. We spend about $1.5 billion a year. But, that in some ways is a thin reed in a tearing tsunami of a wind in terms of some of the changes going on in the world, not least with the conflict in Ukraine at the moment. And, we are a thin reed when up against state power. We don't have armies, we don't have guns, we have the ultimate soft power tools of persuasion and principles and values on our side. And, so it is challenging to find the interventions and the partners that can arrest this deterioration of open society. And, where we look for it is around a strategy which focuses in part on, and centrally perhaps, on making democracy work for the many. As we've, I said this earlier, as we've gone around this sort of strategy and branding exercise, whether it is in Latin America, where our leadership are worried about the exclusion of indigenous peoples from the political, if you like, arrangement and compact, or whether it is in Africa, where there is a fundamental sense that development and governance is something that is done to people, not by people, for people, and in Eastern Europe, where our colleagues are beleaguered and oppressed by the sort of pushback on human rights and democracy. Everywhere, the central argument is, let's not just spend our time criticizing authoritarianism. Let's stand up a democracy model that works, that really is inclusive, which hears the voices of all, which responds to their needs and provides a governance which is accountable to them and delivers the kind of support, the human security, as it's sometimes called, for them and their families. And that if we could get that core proposition right, then around it, the issue of support to human rights, of challenging the kind of the vectors which have driven this change, this adverse change in the state of democracy, such as the rise of a really flawed media model, and fake news and all that goes with it, or the rise of inequality, which is so directly feeding into this crisis of democracy in the minds of ordinary people around the world. If we can help address those in innovative ways, then we can begin to reverse this. And if above all, we can focus on the issues that people care about, whether it is climate, not as an abstract, but in the very real ways it touches on people's lives in terms of loss of environmental cover, whether it is trees, ground soils, water, whatever. Across a range of these issues, we are really trying to frame it as issues about rights and democracy and government accountability and delivery. And as I say, we're just one voice amongst many, but I think as we move in this direction, we hope we're going to demonstrate not just our own relevance, which ultimately in the great sweep of history is much less significant than the proposition we're trying to assert, which is that democracy can work for the majority. It is not necessarily something only to be enjoyed by elites. And, so we want to sort of take on the critics of democracy, if you like, on their own terms. And just perhaps one last word about Ukraine, because I think, it is challenging, and because I'm ex-UN, I get pressed on this a lot, because, 141 countries came through and voted to condemn what Russia had done in the General Assembly. A smaller number, but still a sufficient majority, came through to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. And there is no doubt across the whole UN membership a universal view, with maybe only a handful, certainly less than 10 states, who really take exception to the point that Russia breached the cardinal rule of the UN system, or particularly President Putin breached it. Strong countries don't invade weak neighbors without good cause and without a legal case for doing so around well-rehearsed international legal principles. And so a small African country with a stronger neighbor is as concerned by this as a European power. But what has distressed and frustrated developing countries, as many of you, I'm sure, in this room and on that line have direct experience of, is this sort of Western preoccupation with crushing everything down to Ukraine and that issue. This refusal to understand the wider context that Ukraine is just the latest in a series of global disruptions over the last decade, starting with the financial crisis, but going through the trade wars, going through COVID, in between Brexit, the Trump election, a whole series of shocks to the international system, which are compounded now to the point of, rising inflation rates, rising energy and food prices, dramatic ones, not just that 30% of the international wheat market is produced by Russia and Ukraine, but that the fertilizer, which will secure next year's food crops, is heavily produced by Russia. So, this feeling that much of the world is headed towards very high levels of debt, towards high inflation, lower growth, fewer jobs, in an environment where food and energy are a much bigger part of household budgets than would be the case here, and that the West is not hearing it, that they are so focused on isolating Russia that they can't, if you like, walk and talk at the same time. They can't multitask and address this wider economic crisis. And for us at Open Society, that kind of failure to hear and respond to a problem, which comes on the heels of COVID, where there was such a sense of vaccine injustice and inequality, that it's left this really deep sense of frustration in the leadership and peoples of regions such as Africa, but not exclusive, not only Africa, a feeling that, there are two rules in the world, one for the rich world, one for the rest. And, that's exactly the kind of threat to democracy that I'm talking about. Democratic governance is not just an issue at a national level. It's about global systems too, which respond to people's needs, which are principles-based, but driven by accountability and democratic ownership. So I think the challenge of renewal is not limited just to national government, or it's very much around international governance as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was sobering, especially hearing you say how many countries you've had to close offices in. I think I hadn't quite appreciated how much you're at the sharp end as an institution of this crisis. So let me start with Popper, which is where you started. In his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, one of the reasons he wrote it is he was writing in a time of war, and he thought that democracies and open societies will not go to war with each other. And by and large, that's proven to be true. Do you think that this current return of war to Europe will galvanize open societies and reverse the kind of demise of democracies that you described in the statistics of Freedom House and others?
Well, I think it may galvanize them. The trouble is, will it also kind of vulgarize and cheapen them? Because if you look back to the last Cold War, the American and Western option was a much better one in terms of freedom and standard of living than the Soviet one. But it was nevertheless a security state version of it. A lot of Americans were locked up for the kind of freedom of speech issues that we hoped Americans would never be locked up for again. And, the same in Western Europe. So, societies which have to be on a war footing and, prioritize security tend to be societies which start to diminish human rights. So, I'd sort of view it with some dismay. But having said that, Minouche, I think you have got a point, because I think, maybe the word is it's going to focus as much as galvanize, on these core democratic challenges. If it makes the West feel it's got to prove every day that it offers a better governance model to people than the other side, and that therefore it accepts the challenge on the same terms I've been talking about open society accepting it, which is it's less about just vilifying your opponents, but about showing that democracy works, renewing democracy, then I think it actually perversely could be a bit of a shot in the arm. But then you've also got to remember the other risk, which is the one I was just talking about, of a West which becomes so deaf to other problems in the world that it in a sense starts to pose the rest of the world a kind of false choice the world doesn't want to make. I mean, I'd say a lot now that at the UN I've never heard the term non-aligned movement used as much as it is at present. This real sense of, look, we don't want to be partitioned into either a China-Russia bloc or a US-NATO bloc. We want a third way. And, last time that happened with the new international economic order and the non-aligned movement, these were countries which did not enjoy the economic and political power they enjoy today. But when, a combination of India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and and others start to echo that, and as I think they will, people will take stock. And I have to say, you know, if I had to choose which of those blocks I'd want to be in, I'd want to be in that third non-aligned block.
Quite, absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of democracy. I mean, you and I could have a nerdy conversation about election administration and constitutional machinery and the regulation of money in politics and the role of the media in the public square and how primaries are sort of, you know, and voting systems and all that stuff. But most people don't care. And at the moment, those who care about democracy have to compete with all the other issues that are occupying people's attention. The pandemic, the economy, climate change, the resurgence of inflation, the pressures on household budgets, all those things. And so how can we get people who are preoccupied with all these other things to care about democracy again? And I'm thinking particularly around young people, because the polling around whether young people care about democracy is quite worrying.
Yeah. Well, Minouche, look, you're right. We could have some very long conversations on that. And, you know, I spent earlier parts of my life as a political consultant to many sort of insurgent progressive campaigns around the world. And then a latter part, you know, flogging election machines and systems. So I know my stuff on that. But, you know, I'm like the mechanic, and which, you know, who knows what's going on under the hood of the car or behind the screen of the computer. But in a world where you don't expect the owner of the car or the, you know, user of the computer to know what's happening behind the screen or under the hood. And I think, you know, in a sense, we have to accept that a lot of that sort of the mechanics of democracy will remain a fairly specialist pastime, but an important one, because, you know, if the car stops and doesn't work, or the computer the screen goes blank, you know, you've got a problem. Yeah. But I think, you know, where you have to focus the sort of wider proposition of why this matters is again on accountability and results. And, you know, I actually think in some ways, you know, what we tend to pit as just a sort of Manichaean struggle between authoritarianism and democracy is two other things at the same time. It's one, a struggle of incumbents versus challenges, because, you know, particularly coming out of COVID, what we're seeing is incumbents who didn't manage it well, whether they are Democrats or autocrats, getting punished for it. And I think that's going to kind of continue. And so, you know, in that sense, it's rather good news that there are a lot of autocrats in power because they're incumbents. And I think quite a few of them are going to have a run for their money to be able to, you know, renew their mandates, even though they've tried to shift the under the bonnet electoral machinery in their favor and use fake news and the rest. So I think Bolsonaro has got his back to the wall in Brazil, and while Modi does not yet have his back to the wall in India, his day will come, I think. And you know, Putin and some others, and certainly Erdogan in Turkey, I think will face an increasingly robust electoral challenge. But the other one is if you like, demographic challenge. It's gerontocrats versus young leaders. And I think this may actually be the real key to change. You know, we've just in the last week been spending a lot of time thinking about Sri Lanka and, you know, really what's going and how we can support the beginnings of a revolution or change, but which, you know, has not yet completely unseated a very corrupt ruling family of the Rajapaksas, but, you know, needs to, before international assistance is really going to come into play and you know, stabilize a country which can't afford food or energy imports at the moment. And you know, what will be the vehicle for that? Some kind of democratic renewal, where some kind of new generation leadership will take over. And, you know, I just see in so many countries in South Asia, but East Asia as well, Southeast Asia as well, but, you know, in parts of Africa too, where, you know, this sort of aging, corrupt leadership issue versus a youth leadership which is struggling to break through, but which has got demography on its side, given the age structures of these countries. And you know, I've been predicting it was about to break through in the last 3 or 4 Nigerian elections. So I kind of have almost given up. Well, I have given up predicting, but you know, if the clock is stopped at midnight, one night time, you'll be right. So, but you know, in Kenya, the same thing, you know, 2 old generation candidates up against each other. Is that really where this is going to finish? Maybe, but I don't think it can hold on as a system for much longer. And even in the US where you have a 79-year-old incumbent, you know, likely to be pitched against his 74-year-old predecessor in a rerun. Well, can that really happen given the age structure of the US? We'll see. Maybe it will. But, you know, I think it will lead to, you know, reduced democratic legitimacy, reduced turnout, all the rest of it. So, you know, I think we're seeing, and it's not just a normal age thing, it is that not in the US, but in the developing world, we've got this particular, and particularly in Africa, this particular age structure, but it's an educational issue as well. You know, you've got a much great expanded higher education offering. You've got all the impatience in countries which are not creating jobs to match that greater educational attainment. And, you know, in country after country, I mean, if you look here in the UK, you see, you know, that there is now a age and education split in the vote, and there is in the US as well. Younger, better educated voters are Democrats or Labour here. You know, older, less educated voters are Conservatives or Republicans. And, you know, a version of that is playing out across the developing world, but stoked by this demographic issue. So I think we're going to see a lot of change. And, you know, we look at Chile, admittedly struggling new president, but, you know, what, 36 years old or something, an ex-student leader. And, you know, I think across Latin America, it may be that we're seeing the first wave of this, where, you know, we're starting to see younger leaders, you know, really breaking through. Your spies had told me I was in Colombia last week. Well, you know, there, an ex-M19 guerrilla looks set to probably win the presidential election next weekend. And if not next weekend, then on a second vote. I think he's a bit older, he may be 50, but, you know, 62, he's a lot older, but he behaves as though he was young. Yeah, there's nothing like the diet of 20 years in the bush to, but, you know, so, but I'd be interested in Andrew's view, but I mean, I just think Latin America may be pointing the way towards a sort of, you know, generational shift. And in each of those Latin American elections, it's been around the sort of service delivery, you know, meet our needs, just make our economies, make our services work proposition. And I think that, you know, if democracy can be about that again, it works.
So in the happy 90s, when you and I worked together at the World Bank, we had this model that open political systems and open economies were married to each other, and they went together. But today we've got this rise of illiberal or authoritarian capitalism. You know, we actually don't have many autocracies left in the world other than North Korea. But basically, the idea that your economy is open to the world has that argument has been won. But the divergence on the political side is very strong. Why do you think that is? What happened?
Well, you know, I think these so-called open economies were actually weighted economies. I mean, the playing field was tilted towards, you know, domestic business elites and establishments in many cases. And, you know, the international actors who came in often escaped tax and regulation in these new jurisdictions they were operating. So, you know, both the domestic elites and the kind of international operators and investors taking advantage of light investment rules, you know, became sources of great grievance, I think, to that younger domestic demographic I've been mentioning. And interestingly, George Soros, who my colleague Darren Walker, the head of the Ford Foundation, wrote an essay recently about George, pointing out that, unlike the earlier generation of great philanthropists, Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller, all of whom believed in capitalism and whose perspective was, capitalism works, but as Christians, in the most part, not all, but mostly Christians, we are going to give back the proceeds of capitalism to people, but not for them to change the system. George is a very strange and different political philanthropist who actually believes the capitalism that's made him rich is flawed. I mean, it's not that he wants to dismantle it and replace it by socialism, but he believes capitalism needs a much heavier regulatory hand to make sure that it genuinely meets what you've described as open markets, rather than markets which just work for
you.
Yeah. So he's always been against what he calls market fundamentalism, and I think it's a cautionary point we should have heard earlier, because I think we all got a little bit seduced by this idea that leave it to the markets, but ultimately what it finally does is pitch markets against people's political rights, because markets operate around, we'll put the money where we're best received and where we're going to get the best returns, and often that can translate into suppressed rights in supply chains, suppressed workers' wages, the lot. So I think we just failed to get that relationship right, and I think democracy works very well with markets as long as markets understand that there is a role for those elected democratically to regulate those markets.
So let me ask you a little bit about the role of universities. So in the European Enlightenment traditions, universities had this special role as kind of bastions of openness and free inquiry, even when they were under a religious umbrella, in pre-revolutionary France or in the UK. Do you still see universities playing that special role, or do you think there's evidence that universities have become less open along with the rest of society?
Well, Minouche, it's a chance for me to praise you again, because I somehow ended up on one of your alumni donor calls, even though I'm not an alumni. George is the donor, not me. But I was so impressed that the way you positioned the LSE in that presentation as being about trying to solve real world problems, because I think there is a sort of ivory tower dimension to universities, which can occasionally be quite exasperating to those of us, in the real world, although we've often would never have had the intellectual development that allowed us to play the roles we've had in the real world if it hadn't been for that ivory tower period of our lives. So, I just loved what you were trying to convey of a university where learning was linked to trying to problem solve for people. And that goes straight to my proposition about a democracy that works, that works for all. And so and I know we have a network of universities that we support through the Open Society University Network, and LSE has been a beneficiary, not as great a beneficiary as I'd like to see it, given that George is an alum at this point. But what that reflects George's own belief that good universities are forever, and a lot of foundations are not. Yeah. He really does believe that there is a sort of legacy role of great universities that can last for centuries. I don't think he imagines that the foundation will last for centuries. He would want it to go out with a spectacular bang, having fought and hopefully won some big democratic battles out there.
Yeah, well, and I think, as you say, that universities, I think, having are about patient encounters
Yeah.
with difference. In places like the LSE, which are so international, students are forced to encounter people with very different backgrounds and views. And that's good practice for democracy.
I think so. You know, if I may, I mean, just perhaps one, because I didn't really, you're right. I mean, I didn't really quite address the central question. I mean, I think that, you know, for us, open society means all views are heard and that people respectfully debate them with each other and occasionally very robustly debate them, because views should be strongly held. And, you know, I think for us, you know, some of what has happened on campuses around the world is, you know, almost as distressing as a Trump or Erdogan doing his stuff in their presidential palaces, because where it does limit debate, you know, and, you know, where there is unreasonable deplatforming of people, you know, from us, you know, as a progressive foundation, nevertheless, because our top value is debate and intellectual engagement, and, you know, the core Popper idea is good ideas come from the clash of those of ideas. You know, we are very uncomfortable at some of the things, you know, done at the moment in universities around this sort of free speech issue.
Yeah. I'm proud to say we have never no platformed anyone in the history of the LSE, and we plan to keep it that way. Let me ask you about the foundation. So often people have described the Open Society Foundation as sprawling. It's got a huge presence, huge number of grantees around the world on a huge array of issues. You've taken on this role at a critical time in its history. Tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about in terms of the future of the foundation, and also a little bit about its political role. So there's, you know, and its legacy. You know, the foundation is also involved in highly political issues, probably more than any foundation that I'm aware of. How are you going to navigate that in a world in which politics is so fraught? And what would you like its legacy to be? Tell us a little bit more about this bang you're planning.
Well, look, just, I mean, on the first bit, the sprawling, you know, some of you, I mean, Salil Chetty was a colleague at UNDP and is now a colleague at OSF, will remember that the same word was applied to UNDP. It was described as sprawling. And, you know, we, you know, made a huge point of trying to focus in on a handful of things that we felt we could do with sufficient resource behind them, you know, in a targeted number of countries, that we were going to make a difference. So there is a simple management discipline at the core of this. You know, you can't do everything. And, you know, the foundation had become sprawling for the best of purposes, partly because, you know, it had a series, well, George Soros particularly, but other members of his family, some of the leadership in the past, you know, were very given to pursuing new objectives without discarding old ones. So we were kind of a foundation with a kind of, which looked like a kind of collector's museum of, you know, we just added initiatives as time had gone on, and, you know, not spun out enough or closed enough. You know, some we had. I mean, we were one of the early actors in the early childhood space and have very successfully spun that out. We've done some similar things on some of our drug work. So, but in general, we just grown and grown and grown, and therefore, because resources remained relatively finite, it got spread thinner and thinner. And so, you know, the core issue is for us is to focus back in on these key changes in the democratic landscape. And, you know, where that has meant that we can do rather less of some of the things we'd done in the past, which were, if you like, the sort of finishing off the tributaries of democracy. And I'd mentioned LGBTQI, for example, which we will continue to support. But, you know, but in truth, you know, I tweeted some research last week, which I thought made an important point, which is that, you know, in countries whose democracy is moving in the wrong direction, there is a high correlation with the deterioration of LGBTQI rights, you know? So by focusing on fixing democracy, you are not betraying that other agenda, but you're saying there's a sequence here. We've got to get that basic democratic platform in place, because that's the journey which will allow us to get those, you know, those other rights resecured. And, you know, it's Hungary, a country I've not mentioned, but which, you know, we're dismayed because, you know, there's an incumbent and an autocrat who just holds on through election after election, Orban. But, you know, he, for example, allowed an LGBTQI referendum to be put on the ballot in this last election, and used it to mobilize his non-metropolitan rural base. You know, so there's also the sort of political smart bit here. You know, how do you, you know, first try and defeat a guy like that and then come back to that issue, rather than getting yourself into a position where he can use the issue against as a dog whistle politics. Yeah. So, you know, and that in turn takes me to your point about how political we are. We are political. We call ourselves a political philanthropy, and, you know, we're willing to take on issues that others won't. And that's, again, you know, a founder with nerves of steel who made his money, you know, gambling his fortune every day.
Right. This is easy, right?
You know, but he's willing to do it because, you know, for him, the returns are huge when we succeed and when we win. But we're not, I mean, separately, through George personally and his family, they invest heavily in particularly US politics. But, you know, for me, the rule is to try and keep the foundation out of direct, you know, one side partisan electoral politics, but to come close. So, for example, you know, in Brazil, you have to vote over the age of 18 onwards, but you're allowed to vote from the age of 16. You know, 16 to 18-year-olds in Brazil, you know, are overwhelmingly anti-Bolsonaro. You know, you would expect that. So, you know, we happily support voter registration efforts and getting youngsters to vote and go out and vote. So, you know, but we wouldn't support the Lula political party or something. So, you know, so for us, it's very true to our mission, which is to get everybody's voice engaged and everybody to vote and to the ballot box. You know, even though we're very conscious often of the consequences of that, which is that, you know, different demographics or ethnic groups or classes, you know, don't split 50-50. They have, you know, particular preferences in an election.
I have to ask you this because you're one of the most astute media observers I know. And I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the future of democracy and the media landscape. I mean, we all know the problem with the media. The business model has failed. And you know, you hear people, you know, the business models for the media are the state, which is true in places like, you know, China and Russia, rich men buy the media, or I have now heard a new argument by a prominent media person that we need to think of the media like a foundation. It has to be like a charity, which is endowed and able to support itself to retain independence. But without a viable model for the media, how do we have true democracies in which we have shared evidence-based facts and so on? What do you think about? What's the answer there?
Minouche, I think it's a huge issue, and, you know, we've traditionally tackled it through grant making, which has really been to two different sets of media. One, to a lot of the invested media operations. So, you know, groups like the ICIJ or Bellingcat, which covers Russia. I mean, we're pretty much all the groups who are doing the invested journalism, which traditionally would have been done by newsrooms, you know, we support. We secondly, you know, have tried to, in countries which have very, very beleaguered local media, particularly now increasingly social media, but which is run professionally and is an attempt to keep an alternative voice alive. You know, we have also provided grant making to quite a few of those in quite a few countries. I myself, you know, have concluded and my colleagues very much share this, that that isn't actually anymore enough, and that we need to do two things. One, be very engaged in the global regulatory battle around the social media, and we are through a host of grantees in that space. And second, to actually use our investment arms, both the sort of Soros Fund Management, which manages the endowment, but also our impact investment arm, which is inside the foundation, to start trying to find financially long-term viable media models. Because the sort of, you've pointed to the biggest failing of the grant making solution, which is it becomes permanent subsidy, and even wealthy foundations can't sustain the kind of level of funding needed. But it doesn't stop there. It tends to be media which then kind of freezes where it is. For example, where you support some newspaper groups or radio groups, there's a risk that actually youngsters are going to completely different media sources for their media. And, you've removed the commercial incentive for these organizations to reinvent themselves so they can chase their market by providing a subsidy for them. So, so I feel that we've got to become, sort of an investment innovator in trying to find media opportunities where we can help the owner through investment, introduce new technology, reach new audiences, find new revenue streams, and that we shouldn't give up and just flip to a subsidy grant model. We with all those people out there, active on the social media, there's got to be a news model that works.
Yeah. Last question from me, and then I'll open it to the audience in the room, and then after that, I'll turn to the audience online. And it's about the UN, where you started. You said in your talk that that the West can't walk and talk at the same time, and that there is definitely a bitterness after the COVID vaccine debacle, and a feeling among those in low-income countries that actually they don't care about our lives, and that's very profound, I think. What can the UN do, the most important central multilateral institution in the system, to rebuild the spirit of global cooperation, which is painfully absent at the moment? And are we beginning to see some signs of that as we hear some in the West talking about having to do something about the food and fuel crisis, the concerns about the risk of famine, the concerns about a future debt crisis in the developing world? Do you think that we are beginning to see the realization that we can't carry on like this, and that we need to think of a slightly more integrated view of the world and its problems?
I hope so, but I'm not sure. I actually think the deterioration in the standing of the UN as a consequence of Ukraine has, I'm afraid to say, accelerated. And, I used the term non-aligned movement earlier. The other phrase around the UN at the moment a lot is League of Nations, a feeling that, this fundamental failure around Ukraine at the political level, is a sort of the equivalent of Abyssinia or whatever, in the case of the League of Nations. I think this is completely overblown, because, when you've had permanent members of the Security Council divided on previous conflicts, the UN has done no better than it has done this time often. I think in my time with Kofi, a legendary and remarkable Secretary General, it didn't stop him using his good offices in a much more dynamic way than has happened since or before often. But I think the UN is struggling with this, and I would just say that the one area where it has made some modest progress around the visit of the Secretary General to Moscow and Kiev, and Mark Lowcock's successor, Martin Griffiths, a Brit, has been critical in this, has been some of these brief humanitarian corridors, like getting hundreds of civilians out of Mariupol, but not thousands. And it's been the ICRC and OCHA, the humanitarian office of the UN, which have scored these very modest achievements. But if there's a lesson from that, it's the UN I knew and began in as a young refugee officer was a UN which was excellent at sort of technical assistance to post-colonial countries on their agricultural or education sectors, and excellent at humanitarian support to countries that had gotten caught up in Cold War proxy wars. So, I earned my spurs in Southeast Asia after Vietnam, then in the Horn of Africa, then in Central America, South Asia, and in each of these cases, there was a sort of a Russian-American, Soviet-American standoff or allowance for a space for the UN to come in and deal with the massive human surges and migration flows and displacements that were a consequence of these proxy wars. But the UN was never allowed anywhere near the table when it came to the political resolution of these crises. And in a sense, we've seen that played out in Ukraine. Okay, you can come and help get these civilians out, you can sort that out, because it's embarrassing for all sides that this is happening. But don't pretend that you're going to have a seat at the table when it comes to the political negotiation. And so, I see a UN journeying back in time to that sort of pre-89, where, it had a big office with a door political affairs on it and Security Council affairs, and, but it was of almost no value in terms of world peacekeeping and solution. It did peacekeeping, but it was of no value in terms of peacemaking and solutions, except in small wars in out of the way places. And great success in Central America, even at the height of the Cold War, in that sense, for example. But that, I'm afraid, is where the UN is being pushed back to. Again, just perhaps one last other little sort of green shoot of possible good news. I'm very struck, spending half my time in New York and going across to the UN quite a lot, that some of the more enlightened ambassadors are actually taking advantage of this moment to try and create some small reforms, but of the kind, the butterfly that starts flying on one side of the world and actually creates a tornado on the other side, and there's a little bit of that going on. So small examples. Taking Russia off the Human Rights Council, it's actually made the Human Rights Council a better place. Taking Russia off the NGO committee that accredits NGOs has allowed, with luck, some NGOs which have been blocked by Russia for years to get accreditation into the UN. And third, and perhaps most significant, a long serving PR from Liechtenstein. I mean, if you're, what else do you, only one good public sector job in Liechtenstein, being ambassador to the UN. So they've sent their best guy there, and he's been there forever. And, he's sort of very cleverly come in and put this resolution, which the General Assembly adopted, that every time a P5, permanent 5 member of the Security Council exercises its veto in future, there will be a General Assembly vote on that. Now, constitutionally, the GA can't overturn it, but it's taking a principle first used at the time of the Korea War, where the Soviets blocked action in the Security Council. The General Assembly did a resolution at that time, and there was a deployment of an American force labeled as a UN force. It wasn't the happiest experience for everybody involved, but that tension and the feeling that the GA is a more democratic forum than the council, is now going to get great increased legitimacy and authority from what, the one hand, seems a small technical change, but I suspect one which will over time, create real ripples and start to change things. So, I'm not in the League of Nations school, but I do think it's a difficult, pretty barren period for the organization. And, I think everybody who cares about it needs to find whatever green shoots we can to sort of nurse and cultivate.
Okay, very good. I'm going to turn to the audience now. If you could raise your hand, and I'm going to start with the woman here, and then the gentleman behind her, and then the one right behind. And if you could just introduce yourself briefly, and then I'll take 3 questions in one go. That's all right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for these interesting insights. My name is Isolde Hegemann. I study social policy here at LSE. And I just wanted to ask a question in Hungary, because you mentioned young leaders that might have momentum. You mentioned universities, and the young leader of the opposition, for the 4th time in a row now, the opposition could not beat Fidesz. The CEU, for example, was forced out of the country. And universities are being privatized and foundations held by party members. So I wanted to ask, what are your hopes for Hungary? And also, what levers do actors like this Open Society Foundation still have in such countries? Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman just behind her.
Hello, my name is Etienne Coppel. I work for Article 19. We're an international human rights organization specialized in freedom of expression. My question is for Lord Malloch-Brown. What was the motivation behind the restructuring of OSF? And what does that mean for NGOs and media actors who look to you for support, and specifically for smaller local organizations who now have to turn to one of 6 regional programs? Thank you.
And then the woman just behind.
Hi, I'm Mathilde. I'm a political science student here at the LSE. I don't know if it's a relevant and useful question in this day and age, but I would love to hear your answer anyways. Did you ever believe in the end of history, and do you believe in it today?
Good question. Okay, very good.
All right. Well, look, on those, first on the Hungary CEU one, we've, Salil, are you running away before I say that Article 19 needs to go to you for a grant?
He's your man, right?
Okay, but on the Hungary CEU point, I think we, as you know, moved CEU to Vienna, and it's sort of caused a lot of heartache for all of us because, to be honest, Budapest is a much better place for it. It was meant to, capture the whole sort of and be an exciting part of the whole change in Central Europe, and to, offer educational opportunities to people from the region and latterly from all over the world, which, were affordable and supported by scholarships and free tuition, etc. And, moving it to Vienna, in a sense, removes the symbolism of being in a new democracy as Hungary initially was. But, the situation had become intolerable, and so we had to do. And, it is tragic that George Soros, as, really one of the champions of Hungary, both during the 80s and then after 1989, ends up, vilified in the country, and every now and again, Viktor Orban, who was at one point a youth leader who'd been given a scholarship by George Soros, and whose party Fidesz were initially a liberal party, and irony of ironies, George Soros, because I at the time in my political consulting world had a team in Hungary, pushed me to go and give training in how to win elections to Fidesz. So, George
You
and
did a good job,
Yeah.
Mark.
George and I both feel he more than me, but we've certainly had it thrown back at us, and then some. And what we've seen in this is some of the worst ghosts of Central Europe past, the sort of Jew baiting and bashing of the past, the vilification of Jewish financiers, stuff dragged out of a dark period of the first half, earlier part of the 20th and 19th centuries history. Although interestingly, the campaign plan which Orban executed in terms of making George Soros the poster boy for, the undermining of the Christian conservative Hungary by encouraging migration, by, bringing foreign investment into the country. That game plan was not written by, the fantastical minds with the ghosts of a past Central Europe in their head. It was a couple of Republican consultants in New York State who tried to flog this plan to others around the world, not with George's name written in, but find a Jewish financier to trash. It works really well if you're running a right-wing campaign. And so it ended up, Orban bought the second-hand campaign plan from these guys, and it is, in a sense, the clearest example of, how, initially you can get elected through, this really kind of nasty fake news, race to the bottom appeal around issues like migration. And then once in, by controlling the media, controlling the state institutions, directing economic support only to those groups that support you in an election, easily identified in Hungary because it's small towns and the countryside versus the cities is how it breaks there. You can get through 4 elections and perhaps more before you go. And, so I think it is really important. And, I think probably really difficult. And I think this last time, probably what happened was, they sort of wanted to outdo Orban by getting a small town mayor who was conservative to run so that they couldn't be outflanked on a bunch of liberal social issues. But they didn't get a candidate who would really kind of excite the metropolitan base. And so, they fell foul again of this sort of master, well-trained campaign strategist. But on the Article 19 point, if I may, I mean, yes, it's right that part of the reorganization is to put much more of the sort of grant-making, decision-making and choice into the hands of our regional programs. And that's because, there was a feeling we need, to build up regional grantees in the field of human rights, that we should be supporting an African infrastructure of human rights activists, etc. But we still have a strong global program of which one of its arms is human rights and a second is free media. And Salil Chetty, who's fled the auditorium in a well-timed way, heads our global programs, is based here in London, as is Mary Fitzgerald, the head of our expression program. Head of our human rights work is actually based in Nairobi, but also available. So we've kept global programs. We've shifted the balance, more regional spending versus a bit less global, because we're classic, like we're a microcosm of a world which people in Asia and in Africa and Latin America want to be involved in the decision making of how funds are spent and who the grantees are in their region. So for me it's a very healthy step towards the fuller democratization of the foundation, but we're very conscious that a smaller organization like Article 19 can get lost in that shift, and we're keen for it not to happen.
Okay.
And then the third one,
End of history.
End of history. I hope I never believed in the end of history. I can't promise that in a euphoric moment, we didn't think this sort of surge of democracy across the world was, unstoppable. But, I think because at the time Fukuyama wrote, I was still working as a political consultant and struggling to prevail against some pretty solid dictatorships around the world. And then subsequently was at the World Bank and the UN. In both all those three fora, I saw that democracy's path to permanent triumph was going to be a very, very difficult and fraught one. And you didn't flip a switch and change the direction of nations and regions direction that easily and that permanently. And so, for me, I'm not surprised. I think, in a way, George and I, even though, I'm just the kind of middle-class Brit, and he's had this extraordinary experience of being born and growing up in Hungary with all the revolution around him. Both of us are such creatures of and students of political change that we'd have, at a certain level, been disappointed if it had been that easy. It should be a struggle. Democracy should always be a struggle, and it should never be taken for granted, and we should always have to fight for it.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to the online audience with some questions from there.
So the first question is from Celia Wright from the OSF. There are certainly many ways that we can respond to rising authoritarianism. Which are priorities at the Open Society Foundation? And most importantly, how did Open Society make the decision to prioritize these and not others?
Okay, give us another one.
The question number 2 is from Anonymous.
Okay.
Reflecting on philanthropy, Martin Luther King once said, "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary." How do we reconcile philanthropy, that of which is concentrated in the hands of a few through dramatic wealth accumulation, with a just and open society? What role should foundations, for example, play towards rebalancing the very systems that enable their creation and continued operations?
Okay, very good.
Right. Well, let's take those Cecilia's first. Look, the way the development of the strategy is in some ways still a process underway, but when we looked across what our programs were doing in the different regions and globally, there was a tremendous sort of overlap of priorities, this feeling that the fight for democracy was the central task, but that the sort of the areas where you won that, were these different fields of the restoration of a free media that really offered people choice around things, addressing issues of inequality and climate, and these really, and addressing the whole issue of the infrastructure of human rights and the support to effective human rights defenders in different countries. And that while in the past all of this had been a little bit sort of opportunistic and intuitive, that we need to put a lot more science in around what actually does work. I mean, I've for years, coming from a World Bank UNDP background, used to be resisted by the leadership of the foundation when I was a board member, and certainly by George Soros and his son Alex, when I would say we need monitoring and evaluation and learning. That's all right for the Gates Foundation, because they're doing development things that you can measure. You cannot, with human rights and democracy, measure it. And I've had to put up with this for years, and the great advantage of being president is now I get to do it. And I must say, having now done it, I do kind of half get what they mean, that some of these things are not that easy to measure, but you've got to find ways of measuring them, because you've got to be a learning foundation with a learning loop. That means that, you know, when you get things wrong, that lesson is understood and shared across the foundation, and you refine how you make particular kinds of interventions. And in a sense, being a dynamic learning organization starts to come to the second question, which is about the sort of economic injustice that allows philanthropy. And I partly answered it with Darren Walker's, the Ford Foundation's president's observation that, you know, we are the only foundation which actually bites the hand of the capitalism that created us, you know, and very much at the behest of George and Alex's, his son and deputy chairman's say so. But it I think goes wider than that. You know, because not just us, but if you look at all the big foundations in the US, not the older generation, the Rockefellers and Fords, the new generation, which is Gates and ourselves, and the newer generation still, the new West Coast philanthropies coming out of the different IT fortunes. You know, there was a time when our interventions, both domestically in America and around the world, you know, were received pretty benignly as, well, that's very nice that these rich Americans are giving something back. You know, and I've watched myself over the last decade that reaction get properly much more political. You know, what is the legitimacy of what you're doing? And occasionally that demand for accountability and transparency about what we're doing tips into new conspiracy theories. You know, so, you know, Bill Gates, big conspiracy theory out there in the social media that he's invested in big pharma, so, you know, COVID is his way of selling vaccines, you know, which parallels, you know, some of the sort of social media conspiracies around, you know, George Soros, that, you know, he's trying to encourage groups like Black Lives Matters because he's trying to destabilize American democracy in order to, you know, speculate and, you know, then maybe he's a Manchurian candidate who wants to put a socialist in power in America. You know, so what you're seeing is, you know, something which goes beyond George the Jewish financier being vilified to a bigger issue around the legitimacy of foundations in today's world. And I take this very seriously, because while I think the sort of the extremes in the social media conspiracies are disgraceful and absurd, I think the core concern, you know, money's made in this vast amount through, you know, either sort of, you know, because markets allow that to happen, you know, it behoves those who then spend the money, whether it is the man who's made it or his professional managers such as myself, to meet the very highest standards we can of transparency and integrity around that spending. And, you know, because otherwise I have great sympathy for the legitimacy argument.
Let me come back to the audience in the room and see if there are any more questions. Andres, and then the woman back here, and I'll take the woman in the very back. And then I'll come to you in the next round.
Thank you, Minouche, and thanks, Mark, for a wonderful talk. I would like to go back, if I may, to the very beginning. You began, Mark, by saying something that strikes me as very right, that we worried about lots of things over the last 15 and 20 years, and we took off the ball from the main issue, namely liberty and democracy. And then when you sat down, Minouche asked what I thought was just the right question, namely, will the war in the Ukraine help us focus, and will it energize democracies or catalyze? I forget which verb you used. You seemed a bit skeptical, and I want to go back to that issue. And I would like to ask you to put on your hat, which you haven't worn for a while, of a political consultant, because it seems to me that democracy or democracies have a massive marketing and branding problem. As the issue gets described nowadays, there's something called the West, and the West is fighting for democracy in Ukraine. And there's something called the Global South, which are a bunch of people sitting around waiting for the West to come rescue them. And of course, because the West is otherwise engaged, the Global South is upset. If that is the characterization, then the West, or if the West is democracy's defender, democracy is toast, right? Because first of all, that characterization is hugely inaccurate from a purely empirical point of view. India is a democracy, flawed, albeit, but Indonesia is a democracy, and so is Japan, and so is Korea, and so is Brazil, and so is Colombia. And none of those countries are part of the West. In addition to that, as you pointed out toward the end, those countries want to have a say on their own future. So this view that they belong to some sort of homogeneous blob called the Global South, and the main problem in the world is that the West is not paying attention to the Global South, that's deeply offensive to a lot of people. Bottom line, they have a serious, democracy as sold by the West has a serious branding problem. Can you solve that problem for us in the next 2 minutes?
Okay, I think the woman here and then the one in the very back.
Hello, I'm Martha. I'm from the Philanthropy and Global Engagement team here at LSE. And forgive my fumbled two-pronged question relating to the US politics and US media. Currently in the US, the media is being led by Fox News, headed up by Rupert Murdoch, a white billionaire. Fox News is currently spewing a lot of hate speech around the Great Replacement theory at the moment, whilst repealing votes in Black communities. These messages are being picked up and run with. How is it that you tackle those huge critics of democracy that are being swallowed and taken in by so many Americans? And at the same time, you mentioned the Soros family investing in US politics. What are their visions for their gifts within US politics that I would imagine be with the Democratic Party or with other individuals that aren't related to either the Democrats or Republicans? And how can the two be, how is it that, I think that's my question.
It's a big question.
Politics versus politics, the US politics and the media, how they work and very much break away from each other.
Okay, and the last one I think will be the woman in the back. And I'm gonna, all right, I'll take two more. I'm gonna ask you to give short answers because I've got two more questions in the front here that I'm gonna try and squeeze in.
So I see we have a theme on democratic media, but I actually want to ask a broader question about digital technology and inquire whether you think public fascination with or public faith in the democratic potential of information and communication technology has run its course. And more specifically, how open should so-called open societies be towards the tech industry? So when we're looking at trillion-dollar companies like Apple or Alphabet, how can the third sector or civil society innovators reasonably compete under these circumstances?
Very good. And will you introduce yourself?
Sorry, Sita Pena-Gangatter in Department of Media and Communications, LSE.
Look, let me very quickly then, because I do want to make sure we have time. So let me very quickly respond on these, and therefore I'm going to be able to duck doing even a 2-minute issue of rebranding of democracy. But and I think that at the beginning, this crisis, we talked a lot in OSF about how can we, press countries to vote to condemn Russia in the General Assembly so that this is not Russia versus the West, but Russia versus the rest. And, that was achieved because, as I say, there isn't a country out there that really, other than Eritrea and Syria, and that's about it, that doesn't sort of believe this was, a terrible abuse of the UN Charter, what happened. But the issue is that, it's not just that the global South is sort of waiting hands out to be rescued, by the West, as you know, and you acknowledged as you said it, nothing would annoy them more than that characterization, and rightly so. It's that, they do need the West's collaboration to get the G20 debt restructuring thing in place, to get SDRs recycled, to give them the fiscal headroom to get through this next period. They need innovation at the IMF and the World Bank to get, a better resourced green transition and recovery, because the West has kept a dominant hold on these institutions. And yet these are the institutions that governments are steered to get in place the financing plans to address the food, the energy, the debt, and the green recovery agenda that they are also intently facing. And it's the, and so that's part of it, don't get blinkered around Ukraine, except we're in a two-front war here. We've got Ukraine and a security crisis in Europe, which could still easily spin into a European war, but we've also got a global economic crisis, which will almost certainly claim many more lives through hunger and other issues. So, how do we have the bandwidth to deal with both? And that would demonstrate to people a democratic international system that was responsive to demand, rather than one driven by a few owners around one agenda only. And so I think, it comes back, I suspect if we focus group the word democracy, we all know that it wouldn't do terribly well at the moment. And that would be amongst our own here in the UK as well as around the world. So, a language around results and human security and addressing people's needs, and a refashioning of democracy to deliver on that is, for me, I think, where we've really got to take this. The Fox News issue,
where do you start?
Where do I start? One of the happier things is I mentioned that I'm sort of an expert on electoral counting systems. I'm happily hoping that my pension is going to be covered by the fact that the company I chaired until the last US election has sued Fox News for $6 billion because they accused us of having stolen the US election on behalf of the dead President Chavez of Venezuela. So I'm very much hoping that, my happy retirement and golf handicap coming down will all be paid for by Mr. Murdoch, but hasn't happened yet. But, in the meantime, it's the serious bit of the question is true. I mean, Fox has had a terrible impact on the quality of US democracy, and there are counterparts around the world which are doing the same thing. And, we are trying to challenge that by supporting, alternative free media. Now, to be honest, we're trying to do it at some of the state and local level in the US, but in general, someone said earlier, how does civil society compete against a well-funded IT sector? Well, the same is true in the media. We are tending to concentrate our efforts to rebuild media, not in the US and the world's really expensive media markets, but in countries which, unless something happens, are trending in the same direction as the US. The Brazils, other countries where you can see Fox News is in the making. We're trying to focus our interventions there because, it is, just beyond it. Now I can't read my own handwriting.
The tech giants and civil society. And
yeah, well, that, and that exactly goes to that point that, I remember OSF at one point wondered whether it should create a kind of PBS, BBC, Facebook, a public service social media platform. And, we did the maths, and, even this very wealthy foundation, was not going to make that happen unless it put, every penny it had behind it. And so instead we've gone, heavily invested into the regulation of this sector. We've been very engaged in Brussels, which is the lead regulator there. We're trying to take the lessons of what's worked in Europe to the US and to the Asian markets. And what we're seeing, is very different faces of the challenge in the different markets. In the US, you've got all the invention going on, but no regulation. In Europe, you've got a much tamer sort of social media platforms, basically the localized versions of the American ones, but much more political will to regulate. And in Asia, we're seeing governments and civil society starting to wake up and looking for regulatory models to borrow. So we look at this as a very important part of our work in the next few years.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in two more questions. The woman here and then Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Well, no questions. I am Lul Aseyum. I just wanted to say thank you to our speaker for being someone who sticks up and not bend with the wind. And you are on my list of people who make me reconsider my campaign against cloning. So thank you for being you. At the same time, I would like to thank the chair, not only for being the role model that you are for women, but also for creating for us a platform like this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
Thank you.
And Mark?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm Mark Lowcock. I used to work on humanitarian affairs at the UN, and now, among other things, I'm a visiting professor here at the LSE. So thank you, Mark, for a predictably insightful and wide-ranging and stimulating conversation. As I hope everybody in the room knows, Minouche, a year or so ago, published a book on the requirement for a new social contract, what we owe each other. So I wanted to ask you, what is the complementarity or the overlap or the synergy between what you've been talking about and the work of the foundation and what Minouche has set out in What We Owe Each Other?
Thank you, Mark, for an opportunity to make it a really important point, because I think that, that what Minouche wrote in that book is exactly where we need to go. And she's now been translated into 12 languages. And I think it is, in her case, it's very much about, bringing, government down to the people around, meeting these basic social contract issues that, Minouche, you were very influential in UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres's borrowing of a lot of the language around this in his report. Our Common Future report. And I think it is critical, but I think, in a way, it is this national and local level where it really matters. And I think, an example of that is, at the same time that this has been a horrible decade for national leaders and governments and its quality in general, it's been a pretty good decade for cities and mayors. Why? Because mayors have generally got it. They've understood that what gets them re-elected is not highfalutin ideas. It's kind of making the schools work and the police work and the health system work. And, and so I look at the different fortunes over the last 10 years of mayors and national leaders as a sort of, interesting exemplar of this point that, people are telling us, don't give us these big labels like democracy, or at least don't hide behind them. I mean, I'm not pretending we dropped the term democracy, but don't hide behind them and say, you've got to vote for Democrats because of the sort of value implicit in democracy. You've got to vote for Democrats because Democrats are accountable. Democrats can be kicked out when they start to fail. And, Democrats only succeed when they deliver for you to allow their re-election. And that, very simple core proposition about democracy is what makes it a system much more able to renew itself and much more accountable and therefore more able to deliver than autocracies, which, you know, have a lifespan around the life of the leader. You see them getting more and more rigid as time goes on, less and less effective at delivering. Almost always built into their DNA is a neglect of government, because most of them have come to power around cutting government, you know, reducing what it delivers. And so, you know, democracy, when it embraces a social contract of the kind Minouche described, you know, has a set of built-in advantages, which it's been very poor in recent years at exercising and delivering on.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I think there are very few people in the world who could have covered the breadth of topics that you've done this evening, ranging from the future of democracy, the shape of the international system, Fox News, voting machines, the future of capitalism, what's happening in Hungary, what's happening in Sri Lanka. It's kind of extraordinary, Mark. And you talked about thin reeds and green shoots. Listening to you made me think it's far less fragile than that. I think this is a very hard time to feel optimistic about the state of the world. Sometimes it feels like the four horsemen of the apocalypse have shown up at our doors. But listening to you has been a complete treat. And I think everyone will walk out of this room feeling a bit more hopeful about the state of the world and really grateful that you play such a big role in it. Thank you, Mark.